I want to start by saying David Solomon, the new Goldman Sachs CEO at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum over in Singapore overnight, said his biggest concern was an overheating economy, suggesting the Fed should be raising rates. I suspect you may have a different point of view.
My biggest concern is a frustrated population. Frustrated because wages haven't gone up in a very long time for most people. We just saw a frustration election. The agenda going forward, we're not going to see agreement on everything, but there's some things we can see agreement on. That should start by increasing the minimum wage. Federal minimum wage is lower after adjusting for inflation than it's been in a very long time. There's no reason why it shouldn't be a first order of business to hike it. There's no reason why it shouldn't be a first order of business to make sure that there's health care and health insurance available for people who already have a pre-existing condition. We put that in place in 2010. That's been stripped away by the Trump administration. There wasn't anybody voting who wanted to see kids with leukemia be ineligible for health insurance. There's a lot we've got to do. And look, you've got a lot of people on your show who won't like this, but there's a lot we need to do to confront excesses of corporate power. We are capitalists. We should stay capitalists. Socialism is lunacy. But why should it cost 3 times as much to get an inhaler for your kid in the United States as it does in Canada or England or France? Why should that happen? People disagree on lots of things, but nobody wants our politics to be the way it is right now. If every corporation can contribute almost no questions asked money, why shouldn't every citizen be able to register to vote without leaping through a large number of hoops? And perhaps most important, and I know that's just what Bloomberg's talking about in Singapore, our country faces an economic challenge, the likes of which we haven't faced before, from China. We're not going to win that by trying to hold China down. We've got to pick ourselves up. That means reasonable investment in infrastructure. That means cleaning up the LaGuardia airports and the roads with potholes. And that means investing in our basic science. People are frustrated, people are mad, people disagree about a lot of things, but I don't think anybody's for falling behind China. I don't think anybody's for our kids not being able to buy inhalers.
Right.
I don't think anybody's for wages being where they were 25 years ago. There are things we can agree on and move forward, and that should be the agenda going forward.
So we have Ralph Schlosstein here, and I know you two know each other terribly well. And I want Larry to jump in. I want Ralph to jump in here and respond to Larry. I think you probably agree with an awful lot of what Larry Summers just said. At the same time, aren't there larger forces that technology is bringing to bear that really increase the returns on capital and actually hold them flat or reduce them on labor? And can the government do anything about that?
Well, it's probably one of the hardest issues, in my view, to address. And our current president has blamed trade for the issue that Larry focused on, which is probably the single most important issue economically, not only in the United States, but in virtually all of the developed world. The returns that are going to capital, and obviously the holders of capital are the upper 1% or 5%, continue to be very strong, and the returns to labor, particularly not highly skilled labor, are flattening off, or in real terms actually declining. How do you fix that? In the long run, you fix it with education and retraining. People are likely to have several jobs in their lives. Right. Look at you, David.
I can't hold
You were a lawyer, you were an executive, and now you're sitting here.
And he went to Flint. He was born in Flint, Michigan. So let's not forget the Flint.
Fortunately, he didn't drink the water there.
Right. No, fair point. Larry, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, look, there are all kinds of fundamental forces, but there's no reason why, if our country couldn't afford a certain minimum wage 20 years ago, it can't afford that minimum wage at the federal level today. We've got all these CEOs talking about how they want to make the world better. Here's what we did at Harvard. We said that everyone who we hired, if we hired a subcontractor to mow our lawns or to serve food to our students, they had to meet the same wage policies that we met for Harvard employees. If we started seeing that practice emulated across wages, across all the big companies in the country, we would see a big increase in tens of millions of people's wages, and we would see a more equal income distribution. So, look, there are fundamental forces, but it's not like companies can't afford to pay higher wages. And what we're seeing is a ton of social dumping, you might call it. No, we don't pay high wages. We just hire somebody to clean our building who pays very low wages and doesn't give benefits to workers. And corporations should move past that. Yeah. Frankly, when I hear people coming on your show and saying, at a moment like this, the top policy agenda for the United States is to raise interest rates, and I think about the degree of frustration that is out there, I just don't think that raising interest rates is one of the 10 most important things that we need to do to make this country work.
So Larry,
for ordinary Americans.
Larry, you agree with President Trump?
Stop clocks are right twice a day. I think that, look, I don't agree with President Trump. I think it's crazy to bash the Fed in the way he is. I think the Fed has a responsibility to balance with respect to inflation. But somehow the idea that the principal policy problem we should be discussing is that too many people are working, or that there's too much pressure, or it's too hard for companies to find workers, that's the principal problem we should be discussing in our economy, when there are kids dying because they can't afford inhalers because we've stripped away health insurance. That's just not right. And it's not right for business for the long run, because the frustrations and the conflict that it's going to engender are going to cause all kinds of irresponsible responses. We can find ways of solving these problems where America stays a free market economy, the place in the world where entrepreneurs can best start their companies, where business is an engine of innovation. But we can't do it if our agenda is simply to fight with each other, or our agenda is simply to start with the concerns of those who are already best off.
So, Larry, let me put Ralph Schlosstein on the spot here, because a lot of these corporate entities that have gotten so powerful that Larry says is a good part of the problem are your clients. And in fact, you even help them get more powerful through mergers and through consolidation. They don't want to make the world a worse place. What factors are that really drive us to agglomeration of power by the big corporations and consolidation?
Well, the factors that drive them to do it is that historically we've had a relatively slow growing economy in nominal terms. That means top line growth is relatively slow. And by putting two companies together, you can take out some costs, and that boosts earnings. The point Larry is making, though, about a minimum wage, it's unconscionable that we have a not small part of the country that is working full time and really can't make ends meet. And so, it would actually be a positive addition to the economy, in my view, for both Democrats and Republicans to get together, and not only the longer term things like investing in education and retraining, but also making sure that if somebody's going to work 40 hours a week, they can put a roof over their head and get health insurance and feed their family.
So the companies that you talk to, if there was a raise in the federal minimum wage, they'd be okay with that?
Yeah, I think.
Or would it siphon off?
I don't think you wouldn't find a massive amount of resistance to that, except from certain industries which have a lot of entry-level jobs. Probably the most visible is the fast food industry and the retail industry.
So Larry, come back to your basic thesis, at least part of your basic thesis, which is there's been too much power concentrated, and it affects both the labor situation as well as the pricing situation. Typically in this country, we address those through antitrust enforcement and through organized labor. We've backed off of those as a government. Go back to the midterms. Where have the Democrats, who tend to favor those things, where have they failed to communicate to the American people so the American people elect people to say, yes, let's have more organized labor. Yes, let's have more vigorous antitrust enforcement?
I think you're going to see the Democrats in a variety of ways point up the failures of antitrust and other regulation in the weeks and months ahead. They certainly should be doing that. Look, it's not a fashionable issue anymore, but our system of labor democracy, somebody tries to organize a union, their management fires them. They have to go through 6 years of legal appeals, and then they get a pittance back in damages. That's not how it should be. There are plenty of problems with traditional models of unionism, and there are models that we can put in going forward that are more cooperative between employees and employers. But look, a lot of this comes down to how the politics works. And when every corporation is a citizen with the privilege of contributing as much money as they wish to influence the electoral process, but they don't give election day off to their workers, and we have it on a work day, unlike in every other major country, we're affecting who's voting, and that's affecting what the outcome is. So yes, there's a lot that people can do to communicate messages more effectively, but we've got to think about the ways in which our political system is fundamentally not fair, and look at who's enabled to vote and who's not enabled to vote.
Ralph, do you agree?
I do agree that we have one party that has consistently been an advocate for legislation and regulatory action that has made the opportunity to vote both available and accessible to as many people as possible. The most recent is the referendum in Florida to allow convicted felons who have been released to once again become full citizens. The other party has basically taken an opposite view and tried to make it not only more difficult to be allowed to vote, but also to actually vote.
But hasn't the fundamental failure been of the people who would advocate that sort of regulatory approach to convince people that's consistent with growth? Because that's actually what I think President Trump really came to office on, saying, you know what, the Obama days were about putting up with 2% or 3% sub growth, and he had all these regulations, and Donald Trump said, we're going to do away with those, and we're going to get growth going. And in fact, we have, at least for the time being. We have
excellent growth going right now, fueled by the sugar high of a fiscal policy that has $1 trillion deficit, near full employment, and a reasonably accommodative monetary policy. To me, the irony is, if you look back, at the last 40, 50 years of economic history, America has had the strongest growth of any developed country. Europe has been collectively somewhat behind us, and Japan has been way behind us. Why has that happened? Growth is a function of population times productivity, workforce times productivity. We have a president who claims to be in favor of growth. The single most important differentiating factor about the United States versus those other economies is immigration.
Right.
And we have a president we all have low birth rates. We don't have birth rates that are sufficient to really have a strong growing economy. Immigration has been the fuel for the American economy.
And Larry, and you're nodding on that, which also brings the broader question of, can the U.S. outperformance continue if the Fed is going to retract some of their monetary policy?
Look, I think the Fed has to be careful. Monetary policy works with long lags, and the history is that they tend to under-recognize those long lags, and that can tip the economy into recession. But I want to come back to this regulatory point and this theory that David talked about, that somehow Democrats with their regulation slow the economy down. Look at the last 50 years of data. And here's what you'll find, David. You'll find that unemployment was lower on average under the Democrats. You'll find that corporate profits were higher on average under the Democrats. You'll find that the stock market rose more rapidly under the Democrats. You'll find that as a consistent pattern. You'll find that the budget deficits were lower and the stage was being set for a stronger economic future. Of course, we've had excesses of regulation. Of course, there have been issues of identity politics that sometimes get into our regulation that don't push the economy forward. Yes, from time to time, there are excesses in the name of environmental protection. But if you look at the core of protecting the American middle class, that pushes the economy forward and makes people live better and more comfortable lives. And when I see that being stripped away, when I see financial regulations to protect against another financial crisis being stripped away, when I see the licenses to be a payday lender and charge people 60 or 100% interest rates, those being put back in place. That's just wrong.
Larry.
That's not helping the economy grow, and that is breeding more of the frustration that we saw.